The world of Karan had been quiet for centuries. Its vast deserts hid ruins from an older age, and its mountains stood like broken teeth against a pale sky. The alien priests who lived there guarded their temples with silence, never letting outsiders step inside. To them, the temple was alive. Its walls could whisper, its statues could listen. None dared test it. But everything changed the day a human walked into their sacred ground. The war had started far from Karan. A fleet of alien warlords pushed through human colonies, burning villages and enslaving entire populations. Ships vanished, worlds fell, and the humans seemed broken. Rumors spread of a human survivor fleeing across space, one who carried something more dangerous than weapons. No one knew his name, no one knew his face. They only said he was heading toward the forbidden temple of Karan. When the human arrived, the skies above the desert turned black with storm. The priests watched from the high walls as he walked barefoot into the sand, wearing only a torn jacket and carrying nothing but an old pack. They expected him to fall. Instead, he climbed the temple steps with the calm of someone who belonged there. His eyes were steady. His steps were certain. The storm raged louder with every footfall, and the priests felt fear twist their throats. Inside the temple, cold light poured from crystals that hung above. Stone statues lined the great hall, tall and armored, their eyes carved from some kind of metal that reflected the light. They had always been still, always silent. But as the human entered the hall, the first sound of grinding stone filled the air. The statues moved. Slowly their heads turned, one by one, until every glowing eye was locked on him. The priests screamed and fell to their knees. They had prayed for centuries, but the statues had never answered. Now, with just a stranger's presence, the temple had awakened. The human did not look surprised. He stood tall, gazing back at the towering figures as if he had seen them before. His hands did not shake. His breathing did not falter. Some of the younger priests whispered that this was a sign of war. Others believed it was the return of the ancient prophecy. Long ago, the legends had spoken of an outsider who would come when the galaxy was in flames. He would not raise a sword, but his presence alone would command armies. The temple would decide if he was worthy. If he was not, it would crush him where he stood. The air grew heavy. Dust fell from the ceiling. One of the statues lifted its arm, the sound echoing like thunder across the chamber. The human did not flinch. He whispered something no one could. "Here." And the storm outside fell silent. The priest felt a chill crawl across their skin. This was no ordinary man. Something ancient walked with him. As the last statue lowered its gaze to him, the great doors behind closed on their own. The human was locked inside. The priests outside could only hear the rumble of shifting stone and the pounding of their own hearts. For the first time in living memory, the temple had chosen someone, and the galaxy beyond would soon learn that this choice would not remain hidden for long. The temple was no longer silent. The grinding sound of stone echoed through the chamber as the statues shifted into new positions, forming a circle around the human. Their glowing eyes burned brighter, like torches ignited in the dark. The air itself seemed to vibrate as if the walls were alive with an ancient heartbeat. The human stood in the center, calm and unshaken, while the priests outside pressed their foreheads against the cold floor in fear. He moved slowly, looking up at each massive figure. To anyone else, the sight would have been unbearable. These statues were older than memory, carved from black stone said to come from another world. Some claimed they were guardians, others said they were watchers. No one knew their true purpose, but now, after centuries of stillness, they were awake. The human did not act like a prisoner. He looked as if he had come for this moment. The high priest, a frail figure with skin like parchment, whispered to his followers outside the door. "The prophecy has begun," he said. "The outsider has entered, and the guardians have risen. The war outside our desert means nothing now. Everything will be decided here." His voice trembled, but his eyes glowed with awe. The younger priests asked if they should run, but he shook his head. No one runs from destiny. Inside, the human placed his hand on the floor. The stone beneath glowed faintly at his touch, lines of blue light racing outward like veins. The statues shifted again, their weapons lowering. Their voices rumbled. Not words, but vibrations that shook dust from the ceiling. The human whispered back, and though no one could understand his language, the temple seemed to answer. The walls pulsed with light, and the air filled with the sound of something awakening deep below. The storm outside had not ended. It had changed. Lightning struck the desert in perfect rhythm with the vibrations inside the temple. The priests raised their heads, their fear turning to wonder. They saw in the lightning shapes of warriors long dead marching across the dunes. The warlords who had attacked human colonies might have thought themselves invincible, but something much older was stirring now. Something beyond their power. As the statues continued to move, their faces lowered until they all looked directly at the human. Their eyes glowed brighter, then dimmed as if waiting for his command. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the world grew completely still. Then, with a single breath, he spoke clearly. His voice rang through the hall, and though the words were in no known tongue, everyone felt their meaning. It was a call, a summons. The temple shook violently, and a sound like a great lock unsealing thundered through the desert. Hidden doors deep within the walls opened, revealing stairways that led into endless darkness. The priests gasped. For thousands of years, no one had seen what lay below the temple. Now the outsider had opened the path without effort. The high priest cried out, his voice breaking. He is chosen. His followers echoed him, though many trembled in fear. Chosen for what, they did not know. But the temple itself had bent to his presence, and no living soul could deny it. The human stepped forward, toward the stairs. The statues did not block his way. Instead, they turned their weapons outward, as though guarding him from any who might try to follow. His figure vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the glowing passage. Outside, the storm reached its peak, lightning striking so close that the ground shook beneath the priest's feet. They lifted their eyes to the sky, and for the first time in centuries they prayed not for themselves but for the stranger who had entered their temple. They prayed because they knew that whatever he found beneath the earth would decide the fate of not just their people, but the galaxy itself. The stairs spiraled down into darkness, the air thick with the scent of stone and time. Each step the human took echoed like a drumbeat, yet he moved without hesitation. The glow of the walls followed him, ancient carvings lighting up one after another, as though the temple itself guided his path. He felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, not only from the statues above but from something deeper, older, waiting below. Behind the sealed doors, the priests clung to each other, whispering prayers. They had lived their entire lives tending the temple without answers, keeping its rituals alive without ever hearing a reply. Now one stranger had stepped inside, and the temple had spoken louder than it had in centuries. Some called it a miracle. Others feared it was doom. But none dared deny that the prophecy was unfolding. The deeper he went, the louder the sound became. It was not a sound of machinery or stone, but of something alive, breathing beneath the temple. The passage widened into a chamber so vast it seemed endless. At the center stood a massive structure, half buried in the earth, pulsing with a faint blue light. It was no statue, it was no altar, it was a vessel, an ancient ship of impossible design, chained in place by pillars of stone. The human walked closer, his footsteps lighting ancient glyphs on the ground. They formed patterns around the ship, glowing brighter with every step he took. He paused, staring at the vessel with calm recognition, as though he had been searching for it all along. His hand hovered above the hull, and the moment his fingers brushed the cold surface, the entire chamber roared to life. The chains cracked, dust falling like rain from the ceiling. The glyphs blazed so brightly the human had to shield his eyes. The ship groaned as if awakening from a deep slumber, its surface shifting with lines of light that formed a symbol older than any priest's memory. It was not of their language, nor of the humans. It was something beyond both. Above, the priest screamed as the ground trembled. Statues in the great hall shifted again, their weapons raised toward the doors as if protecting the temple from intruders. Outside, the desert cracked open, lightning tearing across the sky in blinding flashes. The warlord scouts who had been hiding in the dunes turned their eyes to the storm and fled, their ships scrambling into orbit. The galaxy's hunters knew instinctively that something was wrong. The high priest pressed his palms to the temple doors, his voice trembling with awe. "The Ark awakens," he whispered. "The chains are breaking." The younger priests asked what the Ark was, but he shook his head. "We were never told. Only that when it stirs, the balance of worlds will fall into the hands of the chosen." Deep below, the human placed both hands on the ship. His body trembled as streams of light poured from the hull into him, wrapping around his arms, his chest, his eyes. He did not resist. Instead, he allowed it, as though this was the reason he had come across the stars. His voice echoed through the chamber as he whispered words no one could understand, yet the vessel responded. The light shifted to match the rhythm of his voice, a dialogue between man and machine. For a moment he saw flashes, not of his own life, but of lives long gone. Armies marching beneath alien suns, cities burning under skies of fire, statues like the ones above, standing watch as galaxies tore themselves apart. And then he saw humans, not as they were now, but as they had been in ages forgotten, walking alongside these ancient guardians as equals. The vision ended and the human fell to his knees, gasping for air. The Ark pulsed with life, unchained and awake. It was waiting for him to command it, but above the desert, enemy warships had already begun to gather. The warlords who had crushed human colonies were converging, drawn by the storm of energy the temple unleashed. The priests could see their lights in the sky. The war outside was no longer distant. It was coming straight for them. The desert sky burned with fire. Enemy warships entered the atmosphere, their engines roaring like thunder. Beams of light pierced the clouds as the warlords' armies descended. To them, Karen was only a barren world with a forgotten temple, but now the storm of power rising from its sands had caught their attention. They came for conquest, but none of them understood what waited below. The priests stood trembling at the temple gates. Some wanted to flee into the mountains, others to lock themselves inside. But the high priest raised his frail hands. "Stand your ground," he commanded. "This place belongs not to us, but to the one chosen by the Ark. To leave now is to betray everything we have kept alive." His voice carried through the storm, and though fear shook their bodies, the priests obeyed. Inside the chamber, the human rose from his knees, his breathing slow but steady. The Ark pulsed as though alive, its lights responding to his heartbeat. He placed his hand back on its hull, and this time the reaction was immediate. Energy surged through the chamber, blasting outward in waves of light. The chains shattered completely, falling into dust. The Ark lifted slightly from the ground, suspended by its own power, humming like the song of a giant. The statues above echoed the Ark's awakening. They stepped from their places along the great hall, the ground quaking under their stone feet. Their weapons glowed with radiant fire, and for the first time in living memory, they marched. The priests fell silent as the guardians formed lines, their heads turning toward the sealed gates as if waiting for a command. The high priest realized the truth then. The temple had not been built to worship the Ark. It had been built to protect it until the chosen came. The outsider was not a trespasser. He was the key. Above the desert, the first of the warlords' ships landed. Troops spilled out, armored beasts with snarling faces and weapons clutched in their claws. They advanced toward the temple, laughter in their throats. To them, the priests were nothing but fragile prey. But before they reached the steps, the temple doors opened on their own. Out marched the statues, towering giants of stone and light, their weapons raised high. The invaders stopped in shock. None had ever seen guardians move. None had believed the old legends. Now, as the first line of statues roared with voices like breaking mountains, the warlord's soldiers faltered. The human appeared in the doorway behind them. His figure was small compared to the stone guardians, yet his presence carried the same weight. He raised his hand, and the statues moved as if answering his silent command. With each step he took, the ark's light glowed brighter behind him, filling the temple with brilliance. The first clash shook the desert. The guardians struck with weapons that burned through armor, crushing the invaders with every swing. The warlords' troops returned fire, energy bolts striking the stone, but the guardians did not fall. They marched forward like an unstoppable tide. The human's eyes glowed faintly as though he shared their vision, guiding them with thought alone. The priests watched in awe. They had seen countless battles across history, but never one where stone itself fought with such fury. The high priest whispered, "He does not command them. He awakens what they already were." His words spread among his followers, who now looked at the human with reverence. But above, more ships broke through the clouds. The warlords themselves were coming, their banners burning in the storm. They had crushed worlds before, and they would not turn away from Karen so easily. The human knew this was only the beginning. The ark's awakening had been felt across the stars, and the warlords would bring their full strength to claim it. The statues alone could not hold them forever. He turned back toward the glowing ark, its form rising higher as if waiting for him to step inside. His path was clear now. To protect not only the temple but the galaxy beyond, he would need to awaken more than guardians. He would need to awaken the ark itself. The storm above Karen grew darker, lightning tearing across the sky as if the planet itself sensed what was coming. The guardians clashed with the first wave of invaders, their glowing weapons smashing through armor and scattering soldiers like dry leaves in the wind. The desert shook under the weight of battle, but still more enemy ships descended, covering the horizon with fire. The human stood at the threshold of the temple, his eyes glowing faintly with the ark's light. The guardians moved as if tied to his thoughts, striking when he willed, shielding when he desired. Yet he knew this fight was not enough. The warlords commanded entire fleets. Their armies would not stop until the temple was ash and the ark was theirs. The guardians were powerful, but they were only the first step. He turned back toward the great chamber where the ark pulsed like a heart newly awakened. The air around it shimmered, every beat sending ripples of light through the stone walls. The human approached, his steps steady despite the tremors of battle above. He reached the hull once more, pressing both hands against its surface. This time the ark reacted not with light alone, but with voice. It was not a voice in words, but in thought. It spoke in images and feelings, of battles fought long before, of entire civilizations guided by its presence, of a bond between guardians and the chosen. The ark had slept for ages, waiting for one who could wake it. Now it asked a single question, not in sound but in meaning. "Will you bear the weight?" The human closed his eyes, and the answer was clear. He had walked across burning colonies, through shattered fleets, past graves that stretched across the stars. He had seen his people fall, and he had carried their last hopes to this place. He whispered a single word that echoed across the chamber. Yes, the ark roared to life. Chains of light spiraled outward, wrapping around him. His body lifted from the ground, energy coursing through him, until his very veins glowed. The chamber shook violently as the ark rose higher, its ancient hull reshaping itself, lines of fire tracing along its surface. The priests above fell to their knees as a column of light erupted from the temple roof, piercing the clouds and shattering the storm. The warlords' ships turned their weapons toward the temple. Blasts of fire struck the walls, but the guardians raised their arms, forming a barrier of glowing energy that absorbed the strikes. The high priest shouted to his people, "Do not fear, the ark has chosen and its power cannot be broken." His voice carried into the storm, but his eyes were fixed on the light above the temple. Inside, the human's body trembled as the ark's power flowed into him. He saw visions again, not of the past, but of the future. Worlds burning if he failed. Worlds alive if he endured. He saw the warlords broken beneath skies lit with hope, and he saw his people rise once more. The burden was crushing, but he did not falter. The ark's systems awoke fully, symbols flashing across its hull. What had once looked like an ancient relic now gleamed with living fire. Engines hummed with power, long dormant, but never dead. Slowly the ark lifted from the chamber floor, floating upward as if it had always belonged to the skies. The priests gasped as the ground split open, ancient stones moving aside to form a path. The ark emerged, rising above the temple, its light flooding the desert. The guardians roared in unison, their weapons blazing as they pushed back the invaders. For the first time in centuries, Karen was alive with fire and purpose. The warlords, fleets opened fire, filling the sky with beams of destruction, but the ark responded, its shields flaring, its weapons awakening with brilliance no living soldier had ever seen. The human stood within, not as a passenger, but as its heart. He was no longer just a survivor. He was the chosen. The galaxy did not yet know it, but the true war had begun. The ark rose above the temple like a second sun, its light piercing the storm clouds and casting the desert in a glow that turned night into day. The guardians roared from below, pushing the invaders back with every strike of their blazing weapons. But the warlords' fleets filled the horizon, their ships blotting out the stars. To them, the temple's awakening was not a sign to retreat. It was a challenge to crush. The warlords themselves appeared, stepping from their command vessels in armored forms that towered over their soldiers. Their voices carried across the battlefield, deep and thunderous. "Seize the ark," they commanded. "Tear down the temple, kill the chosen." Their words sent waves of soldiers forward, armed with weapons designed to rip through cities. The desert floor shook under the march of thousands. Inside the ark, the human stood at its core, his body surrounded by streams of living light. Every breath he took resonated with the ship. Every thought he had rippled through its systems. The ark was not a tool. It was a bond, a living being that now shared his will. Together, they became one force. The first barrage struck. Warlord ships unleashed storms of fire at the ark, beams that could slice mountains in two. The desert lit up as explosions tore through the sands, the priests screaming as they shielded their faces. But when the smoke cleared, the ark remained. Its shields glowed like a shimmering dome, stronger than any fortress. The human opened his eyes glowing with the same blue light that flowed through the ark. He lifted his hand and the ship answered. A wave of energy erupted from its hull, cutting through the nearest enemy ship like paper. The warlords' laughter turned into roars of rage as one of their vessels fell burning from the sky, crashing into the dunes in a sea of fire. The battle exploded in full. Dozens of ships circled the ark, firing relentlessly while waves of soldiers charged the temple gates. The guardians met them head-on, each swing of their weapons crushing entire squads. The priests sang prayers, their voices rising above the chaos as though their faith itself added strength to the ark. Yet the warlords were not so easily defeated. Their commanders stepped onto the battlefield, leading their troops with brutal precision. Beasts with claws like steel tore into the guardians, managing to shatter stone arms and crack glowing eyes. The sky filled with fire as the fleets pressed, harder, their combined power forcing the ark's shields to flicker. The human gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face as he held the connection. The ark whispered to him, not in fear, but in warning. They will not stop. To defeat them, you must awaken more. The human closed his eyes, focusing deeper. His mind reached past the temple, past the desert, into the stars themselves. He felt echoes, more guardians, buried across other worlds, sleeping, as these had. The ark was not only a ship, it was a key to an entire network of power hidden across the galaxy. But he was not ready to call them yet. The strain alone nearly broke him. The ark's energy burned through his veins like fire. His body was only human, fragile compared to the weight it carried. Still, he stood tall, refusing to let the warlords see weakness. The enemy commanders raised their weapons, calling their fleets closer. "Break him," they roared. "The ark belongs to us." Their voices shook the desert as thousands of troops surged forward, their fire raining down on the temple in an unstoppable storm. The human clenched his fists, his voice rising above the chaos. "Not yours," he shouted. The ark responded instantly, unleashing a beam of light so powerful it split the storm clouds apart and tore through 3 enemy ships at once. The blast left silence in its wake, a silence filled only by the pounding of terrified hearts. The warlords staggered, staring at the glowing figure within the ark. They had faced empires. They had crushed armies. But never had they seen one man stand against them with such power. Still, the sky was filled with their fleets, and the battle had only just begun. The battlefield was chaos. Fire streaked across the sky as warlord ships rained destruction on the desert below. The Guardians fought without pause, their massive weapons crushing invaders in waves, but their stone forms cracked under the sheer numbers. The priests held their ground in the temple's shadow, chanting prayers, their voices trembling but unbroken. The human stood inside the ark, his body glowing with its energy. Each command he gave turned into power, every thought guiding the ship's fury. Yet the enemy fleets pressed closer, dozens of massive vessels surrounding him from every side. The ark's shields blazed with light, but the pressure was relentless. The warlords themselves descended, their colossal forms wrapped in dark armor that glimmered with cruel power. They landed on the sands with the force of falling meteors, their footsteps shaking the battlefield. Standing taller than the Guardians, they carried weapons forged from wars long past. Each one radiated raw strength, their voices booming across the desert. "Outsider," one roared, his voice like thunder. "You are nothing, a mortal standing in power not meant for your kind." Another raised his blade toward the ark. "Surrender, and we will make your death swift." The human did not answer with words. The ark's light flared, a brilliant wave that forced even the Guardians to step back. He rose from the ground, suspended in its glow, and his voice carried across the desert. "This power was waiting for me, not for you. You will not take it." The warlords laughed, their voices sharp and cruel. Then they charged. The Guardians moved to block them, but the warlords struck with devastating force. Their blows shattered stone bodies, breaking through lines of defenders as if they were toys. The priests cried out in despair as one Guardian after another fell, their glowing eyes dimming in the sand. The human clenched his fists inside the ark, and the ship answered with fire. Beams of pure energy tore into the battlefield, striking the warlords with the power of stars. One staggered, roaring in pain as his armor cracked, but the others pressed forward, their strength unshaken. They leapt at the ark, weapons raised high, their shadows blotting out the light. The impact shook the desert. Their blades clashed with the ark's shields, sparks flying in storms of color. The human gasped, feeling the strain as the ark absorbed the blows. Every strike was like thunder in his bones. He felt his body weaken, but he refused to yield. The ark whispered again in his mind, "You are not alone." With those words, the ground beneath the temple trembled. From the sand rose more figures, smaller Guardians buried deep beneath the dunes, their forms cracked but alive. They surged into the fight, striking the warlords' armies with renewed strength. The priests gasped, their chants growing louder, as they saw hope rise again. Still the warlords pressed closer. One swung his massive blade, slicing through a Guardian and striking the ark's shield with a blow that rattled the skies. The human staggered, blood dripping from his lip as the energy threatened to overwhelm him. Yet in his mind, he saw the vision again, burning worlds, dying voices, a galaxy begging for a savior. He roared with defiance, and the ark roared with him. Light exploded outward, brighter than lightning, throwing back the warlords and blasting their soldiers across the dunes. For a heartbeat, silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire. The warlords rose again, their armor scorched but unbroken. They looked at the human, no longer with laughter but with fury. One pointed his weapon toward him. "If you will not kneel, then you will die. No human can carry the weight of gods." The human wiped the blood from his face, his eyes burning with the ark's glow. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Then I will carry more than gods. I will carry every life you tried to break." The warlords roared and charged once more, their fury shaking the desert. The final clash was at hand. The desert burned with fire and light. Guardians fought among shattered dunes, their glowing weapons locked against waves of soldiers. Above, the fleets of the warlords fired endlessly, their blasts raining like a storm of fire. At the center of it all stood the Ark, rising above the temple, its light cutting through the chaos. Within, the human stood as its heart, every breath keeping its power alive. The warlords charged once more, their colossal forms shaking the battlefield. Their blades struck against the Ark's shields, each impact thunderous, each strike threatening to break him. The human staggered under the weight of their fury, his body trembling as the Ark poured its strength into him. Blood ran down his face, but his eyes did not lose their fire. The high priest fell to his knees at the temple gates, his voice breaking in prayer. "Chosen, endure," he whispered. The younger priests echoed him, their voices rising together. Their faith poured into the air like a wave, reaching the Ark's glow. The human felt it, not just prayers, but the weight of every hope, every fear, every life across the stars that waited for deliverance. The Ark spoke once more in his mind. You cannot fight them as one, but you can fight them as all. In that instant, the bond deepened. The Ark's light expanded beyond his body, beyond the chamber, beyond the desert itself. Across the galaxy, ancient sites long forgotten stirred. Buried guardians awoke in distant ruins. Hidden vessels opened their eyes to the stars. A network older than empires spread its power, and for the first time in ages, it found its chosen. The iron, human's body shook as the flood of power surged through him. He was not only himself now. He was connected to every guardian, every ark, every echo of the ancient builders. Their strength flowed into him, and his voice thundered across the battlefield. You will not take this galaxy, not while I stand. The Ark erupted with light. Beams of energy burst from its core, lancing through the warlords' fleets above. Ships exploded in burning fragments, falling from the sky like shattered stars. On the ground, the Guardians surged forward with renewed strength, smashing through enemy lines as if the sands themselves had risen to fight. The warlords roared in rage, striking with desperate fury. But their power, once feared across worlds, faltered against the tide. One fell, his armor cracking under the Ark's light. Another staggered back, a beam tearing through his chest. The last of them raised his blade high, bellowing a final curse, but the human met his strike head-on. The Ark's energy flared, and their clash shook the desert like the birth of a star. When the light faded, the warlord's blade lay broken in the sand. His towering form collapsed, burning away into ash. Silence followed, heavy and endless. The enemy armies, once countless, fell to their knees or fled into the dunes. The sky cleared, the storm dissolving into calm. The priests wept openly, bowing their heads as the guardians returned to stillness, their weapons dimming but their forms standing tall. The high priest whispered, "It is finished." The human stepped from the Ark, his body weak, his breath shallow, yet his eyes still glowed with its fire. The priests rushed forward, falling before him, but he raised his hand gently. "Do not kneel," he said softly. "Stand. The galaxy will need you all." The Ark hummed behind him, no longer chained, no longer hidden. It had chosen, and its choice had saved not only Karen, but every world the warlords sought to enslave. The human looked out over the desert, the flames dying in the distance, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe in peace. But he knew peace would not last forever. The Ark's network stretched across the stars, and with its awakening, others would come, friends, foes, seekers of power. The burden was his to carry. Yet as he looked at the horizon, he did not see despair. He saw a future worth fighting for, and so began the legend of the human who walked into the temple, who turned statues into warriors, who awakened the Ark, and who stood against the might of warlords. His name would echo across ages, not as a conqueror, but as the chosen who lit the galaxy anew.